The morning light in New York was cold, too clean, too honest. It poured through the tall glass windows of Aisha Davis's Upper West Side loft, touching canvases that shimmered with half-finished dreams. Bursts of color trapped between hope and heartbreak. She had painted light her whole life. The way it filtered through stained glass, spilled across city streets after rain, or burned in the eyes of lovers before fading into goodbye. Light was truth to her until that morning. On her desk lay an envelope, cream-colored heavy, embossed in gold. At first glance it looked harmless, elegant even. But when her eyes reached the names, her breath caught. James Winchester and Clara Monroe cordially invite you to celebrate their wedding. For a moment she couldn't move. The world narrowed to that single line, those two names intertwined like a cruel joke. Her mind refused to accept what her eyes had already seen. James, her fiancé of 3 years, the man who'd once said he couldn't imagine a sunrise without her by his side. Clara, her best friend since art school, the woman who'd held her hand when her first gallery opened, who'd stayed up nights painting in silence beside her, sharing cheap wine and promises of forever friendship. Aisha felt something inside her chest tear, not like fabric, but like skin. The kind of pain that was too deep to scream. The envelope slipped from her hand and fluttered to the floor, landing beside a jar of turpentine. The air smelled of oil paint and betrayal. Her studio, once her sanctuary, suddenly felt like a crime scene. Every painting on the wall, every photograph, every brushstroke whispered liar. There was one canvas still wet, the piece she'd been working on for their wedding gift. 2 silhouettes beneath autumn trees, the leaves swirling like golden fire. It had been meant to symbolize their beginning. Now it mocked her. She stood frozen before it, staring until her vision blurred. Then, without warning, she grabbed the palette knife and sliced through the paint. Once. Twice. Again. The sound of tearing canvas filled the silence like thunder. When she stopped, she wasn't sure if she'd destroyed the painting or herself. Her hands trembled, streaked with yellow and red colors of sunlight and wounds. Her phone buzzed on the counter. Dozens of messages. She didn't need to read them. She already knew. New York's art world thrived on gossip, and her humiliation had just become its masterpiece. Ms. Davis. Her assistant's voice came through the intercom, uncertain. The gallery needs your confirmation for Friday's exhibition. Cancel it. But everything. Cancel everything. She turned off her phone. The silence that followed was almost violent. Walking across the room, she opened the curtains wider. Manhattan stretched below, steel and glass reflecting the morning sun. Somewhere out there, James and Clara were probably celebrating their new beginning. The thought made her stomach twist. Her reflection stared back from the window. A woman in a white silk robe, eyes rimmed with red lips, trembling but unbroken. For a fleeting second, she didn't recognize herself. "Who are you without him?" she whispered. The city didn't answer. She poured herself a glass of whiskey, something she rarely drank, and downed it in one burning gulp. It didn't help. The ache was too old, too familiar. She'd spent her whole life proving she was enough for critics, collectors, for a world that praised her art but questioned her skin. And she'd believed James when he said she was his light. Now she realized he'd only ever wanted to stand in her glow. By evening, the apartment was in chaos. Photos, ripped boxes, half-packed. She moved with mechanical precision, her mind blank, except for one thought. Leave. Las Vegas came to her like a dare, a city that didn't ask questions, a place where broken hearts could vanish among strangers and neon lights. Without thinking, she booked a flight for midnight. As she zipped her suitcase, her eyes landed on a small framed picture of her and Clara, at 22, paint on their faces, laughter wild and young. Aisha hesitated, then placed the frame face down. "Goodbye," she whispered, not sure to whom she was speaking. At JFK, the night air bit against her skin. Cameras flashed somewhere near the entrance, a celebrity arriving maybe, but she walked past unseen. A scarf wrapped around her curls, a long beige coat over jeans. She looked like any other woman fleeing something too heavy to name. Inside the terminal, she sat alone at the gate, clutching her boarding pass like a lifeline. Around her, people chatted, scrolled through phones, dozed against each other's shoulders. She envied them their normal heartbreaks, their ordinary problems. On the screen overhead, her flight number blinked, Las Vegas. Boarding soon. Her chest tightened. A man across from her glanced up, smiled politely. She looked away. The last thing she wanted was conversation. Her phone lit up again, James. She watched it vibrate against the bench, each buzz a pulse of the past refusing to die. Then slowly she pressed delete. Somewhere between the city she'd built her name in and the desert city of illusions, Aisha stared out the airplane window. The clouds looked like torn silk. Below them, the night stretched infinite darkness, punctured by occasional sparks of light. She thought of the first time she'd met James at a gallery opening. He'd stood before one of her paintings, claiming he saw God in her brushstrokes. She'd laughed, thinking it was a line. But his eyes had been sincere, or so she'd believed. Now she wondered if he'd seen God, or simply a reflection of himself. Clara's betrayal cut deeper. A best friend's lies were quieter, more intimate. They didn't explode. They eroded. Her fingers traced the condensation on the airplane window, sketching invisible shapes. She used to draw light, even in darkness. But this time, she didn't know where to start. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be landing in approximately 4 hours. The captain's voice crackled over the speaker, breaking her trance. Aisha closed her eyes. For the first time in years, she didn't have a plan. No deadlines, no exhibitions, no promises. Just the raw, unfiltered ache of being alive. And yet, underneath the grief, something faint stirred like the flicker of a match in the wind. Freedom. It terrified her more than the pain ever had. When the plane landed, the desert air was warm, dry, and indifferent. Las Vegas shimmered in the distance, a mirage of gold and neon built entirely on illusion. Perfect, she thought. In the taxi, lights from the strip streaked across her face like brushstrokes on a moving canvas. The city pulsed alive, restless, too bright to be real. Billboards promised love, fortune, redemption. Aisha almost laughed. Redemption. In Vegas. Maybe that was the point. At the Bellagio, the doorman greeted her with practiced politeness. "Welcome, ma'am. Checking in?" "Yes," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "Just me." For the first time, the words didn't hurt. The elevator ride to her room was silent except for the hum of machinery. She caught her reflection in the mirrored wall, eyes, shadowed lips, pressed tight. But there was something else now, too. A quiet defiance. She dropped her bags on the bed and walked straight to the window. Outside the fountain, show burst to life, jets of water, choreographed to music rising and falling under spotlights. She watched, mesmerized. It looked like light trying to escape darkness and somehow succeeding. Her heart thudded softly, painfully. "Maybe I'll paint this," she whispered to no one. Not for the gallery. Not for James. Just for herself. She poured herself a drink from the minibar, raised the glass toward the window's reflection. "To survival," she murmured. The whiskey burned going down, but for once it didn't taste bitter. Later that night, she stepped out onto the hotel balcony. The city stretched below, a galaxy of lights, each one hiding a story. She wondered how many of those stories had begun with loss. The wind tangled her curls as she leaned against the railing, feeling the pulse of Vegas beneath her. For the first time, She wasn't thinking about who had hurt her. She was thinking about who she might become. Somewhere in the distance, a limousine pulled up beneath the hotel's grand entrance. A tall man stepped out, white shirt open at the collar jacket slung over one shoulder. He looked up as if drawn by some invisible thread, and for a brief moment their eyes met. Aisha blinked. It was only a second, barely enough to register the curve of his mouth or the steadiness in his gaze, but something in her chest shifted. The stranger didn't smile. He simply nodded, a gesture so small she almost thought she'd imagined it. Then he disappeared through the revolving doors. Aisha stayed on the balcony long after, her pulse still uneven. She didn't know that his name was Ethan Whitmore. She didn't know he was running from duty, from a wedding, from a life that felt like a prison. All she knew was that for the first time since the envelope arrived, she had looked at someone and felt alive. She turned back to the city. The neon lights blurred, becoming strokes of color like a painting half-born. Tomorrow, she promised herself. Tomorrow she would start again. But tomorrow had already started. And fate, impatient as ever, was already painting its next line. The Bellagio bar glowed like a living painting, liquid gold and glass reflections, shimmering under low light. The kind of place where time blurred, where every smile could be a lie, and every stranger carried a secret. Aisha sat at the far end, wrapped in a quiet elegance that didn't belong to the chaos around her. Her black dress caught the light when she moved, subtle and fluid, like a shadow learning to dance again. She wasn't there to be seen. She was there to disappear. Her drink sat untouched, a Manhattan the color of dusk. The bartender had smiled when she ordered it, probably assuming she'd come to celebrate. He didn't know that her reason for drinking was the opposite of joy. The ice clinked softly, a heartbeat in glass. She traced the rim with her finger, letting the burn of whiskey on her tongue remind her she was still here, still breathing. But the ache in her chest didn't fade. Betrayal had a flavor of its own bitterness that lingered long after the moment had passed. The door opened and something in the air shifted. She noticed him instantly, though she couldn't have said why. He walked in like a man both owning and escaping the world at the same time. White shirt open at the collar, dark hair slightly undone, eyes that had seen too much. He carried the kind of silence that demanded attention, not arrogance, something deeper, a quiet command that drew the room around him like gravity. He sat 2 stools away, not close enough to intrude, but near enough that she could feel the temperature of the air change between them. The scent of smoke and rain followed him, expensive cologne barely masking exhaustion. For a while they said nothing. The bartender poured him a drink, scotch neat, and he nodded a polite thanks before glancing toward her. Their eyes met, and in that moment the bar fell away. The music, the laughter, the hum of slot machines beyond the wall. Everything went still. There was a flicker of recognition, though they'd never met. Like 2 wounded souls accidentally colliding in the middle of a storm. Rough night. His voice was low, textured, a melody half-whispered. She smiled faintly. You could say that. He studied her, not the way men usually did, with hunger or admiration, but with curiosity. Running away. No, she said, turning her glass slowly. Just lost. He nodded, as if he understood all the words she didn't say. Then quietly, sometimes being lost is the only way to find what's real. The sentence lingered between them, fragile as breath. She didn't respond. Couldn't. Because for the first time in weeks, someone wasn't asking her to explain her pain. They were simply standing in it with her. The bartender returned. Another, he asked her. Make it a double, she said before she could stop herself. He poured. The man beside her raised his glass. To lost things, he murmured. She clinked hers against his. And to the fools who chase them. The whiskey burned sweet and sharp. It grounded her, yet loosened something she'd kept caged. He watched her with that calm, unreadable expression. "You look like someone who used to believe in magic," he said softly. "I did," she admitted, "until it turned into a trick. Maybe you were watching the wrong magician." A small laugh escaped her before she could help it. It sounded strange, rusted from disuse but real. The corner of his mouth curved upward almost imperceptibly. She studied him in the dim light, the line of his jaw, the quiet intelligence in his eyes, the sadness beneath his composure. He wasn't trying to impress her. He wasn't trying anything. That perhaps was what made him dangerous. "Ethan," he said suddenly, offering his hand. "Aisha." When their fingers met, a charge passed through her skin. Not fireworks. Something quieter, deeper, like recognition. He didn't ask about her accent, her career, her reason for being there. And she didn't ask what he was escaping. It was a silent agreement between two people who'd had enough of explanations. They talked about everything else instead. Music, favorite cities. The strange way time stretched in airports. He listened like every word mattered. When he laughed, it was rare, unguarded. The kind of sound that made you want to protect it. As hours slipped by, the crowd changed, the bar emptied, but neither of them moved. Aisha's cheeks warmed from the alcohol, but her mind was clear, too clear. She felt the ache of attraction and the weight of caution wrestling inside her. At one point, she caught him watching her reflection in the mirror behind the bar. Not her body, her reflection. As though he were searching for the person she used to be. What she asked quietly. "You have eyes like you've seen heaven," he said, "and hands like you've survived hell." She looked down, unable to meet his gaze. "You talk like a poet." He smiled a sad, knowing smile. "I talk like a man who's lost everything he thought he owned." There it was, the shadow in his voice, the echo of something broken. She wanted to ask, but didn't. Some wounds were sacred. The clock behind the bar struck midnight. He glanced at it, then back at her. "You know what's funny about this city? What people come here to forget, but somehow they end up finding exactly what they ran from." She stared at him, her pulse steady but fast. "What if there's nothing left to find?" "Then maybe," he said, leaning slightly closer, "you build something new." The air between them thickened, charged, uncertain. A silence stretched, dangerous and soft. Then, without warning, she whispered, "Marry me." It was supposed to be a joke, a reckless escape hatch from reality. But when he didn't laugh, her stomach fluttered. His gaze locked on hers, unflinching. "Okay." She blinked. "You're serious?" "Completely. You don't even know me." He tilted his head. "Maybe that's the point." Aisha's breath caught. For one heartbeat, she considered walking away. For the first time since New York, her mind wasn't numb, it was alive. And maybe that's why she didn't move when he stood offering his hand. The world outside the bar glowed electric, the strip alive with promises it never intended to keep. They stepped into the night together, side by side, strangers bound by something they couldn't name. He led her through the street to a small white chapel tucked between two casinos, the kind of place that sold forever for the price of a dinner. Inside it smelled faintly of roses and desperation. An Elvis impersonator in a sequined jumpsuit grinned at them. "Well, aren't y'all a beautiful mess?" Aisha should have laughed. Should have run. Instead, she found herself staring at Ethan, his calm steadiness in the chaos. "Last chance," he murmured, his tone more prayer than challenge. "You can still say no." She hesitated, her heart slamming against her ribs. "I don't even know who you are." "Then make me up," he said softly. "Paint me how you want to remember me." Her eyes stung. "This is insane." He smiled faintly. So is surviving heartbreak. But here you are. When he took her hand, his touch was warm, too real for fantasy. And when the Elvis began the vows, she barely heard the words. All she saw was Ethan's eyes, tired, kind, full of something she hadn't seen in a long time. Truth. They said, I do like it was an act of rebellion. Not against love, but against the idea that love had to make sense. When he kissed her, it wasn't fireworks or desperation. It was quiet, deliberate, like two people sealing a promise neither of them understood yet. Her world tilted, and for the first time in months, she didn't feel broken. Outside, the desert wind carried the scent of rain. Rare, impossible. They walked in silence back to the hotel, their fingers barely touching. He stopped at the entrance, turned to her. I don't want to know who hurt you, he said. Not tonight. She swallowed. And I don't want to know who you're running from. He nodded. Then we're even. In the elevator, their reflections stood side by side in the mirrored wall. Two strangers, two stories crossing for a reason neither could explain. She watched his profile under the golden light, the faint scar along his jaw, the shadows beneath his eyes. There was beauty in his imperfection, danger too. But mostly there was peace. When the doors opened to her floor, he didn't follow. Good night, Mrs. Whoever you think I am, he said quietly. She smiled, the first genuine one in a long time. Good night, whoever you really are. The doors closed. She exhaled. Somewhere between madness and clarity, she realized what she'd done wasn't about escape. It was about reclaiming the part of herself that still believed in reckless hope. Later in her room, she stood by the window again. Below, the fountains danced to music, water glinting like liquid fire. Her reflection looked back, same eyes, same face. But something was different. She touched her lips, still tasting him. Maybe it was insanity. Maybe it was the start of something that would either save or destroy her. She laughed softly to herself. Vegas, she whispered, you really don't play fair. Morning light crept through the silk curtains like an uninvited confession. Soft, relentless, honest. Aisha blinked awake to a room she didn't recognize. High ceilings, marble floors, curtains that whispered when they moved. The air smelled faintly of cedar and champagne, and her head pounded in rhythm with her heartbeat. For a few seconds, she forgot where she was. Then the night came rushing back. The bar, the laughter, the vows, the kiss. Vegas. The stranger. The marriage certificate that might still be in her purse. She groaned softly, pressing a hand to her temple. The bed beside her was empty. For a fleeting, foolish moment, she thought maybe it had all been a dream. Then she heard it, the rustle of paper, the faint clink of a coffee cup. Ethan Whitmore was sitting by the window, bare-chested, beneath an open white shirt, a newspaper spread in his hands. Morning light poured over him, making him look like something half real, half unreachable. He glanced up. Their eyes met. Something unreadable flickered across his face. Regret, maybe, or the weight of a truth waiting too long to be spoken. Morning, he said quietly. His voice carried none of last night's ease. She sat up, the sheets pooling around her waist. Where are we? The Bellagio. The presidential suite. Her brows knit. How? He didn't answer. Instead, he turned his newspaper toward her. Her breath caught. Across the front page, billionaire heir Ethan Whitmore marries in secret Vegas ceremony. Below it, a photo grainy but unmistakable. Her hand in his. The two of them under the glowing neon chapel sign. The caption read, "The Runaway Tycoon and His Mystery Bride." Aisha stared at the image, the world tilting. Every sound seemed distant, the hum of the city below, the faint clatter of dishes in the adjoining suite. "You're joking," she whispered. "This isn't real." "It is," he said softly. "And I'm sorry." Her heart clenched. "Sorry for what?" "For not telling you who I was. For letting you think I was just another stranger trying to forget." He set the newspaper down, folding it neatly. His movements were calm, deliberate, the kind of calm that came from years of hiding panic behind control. "You're Ethan Whitmore," she said slowly, tasting the name. "Whitmore Industries. The man who's on every finance magazine. The billionaire who didn't want to marry the woman my father chose." He finished, his tone clipped. "And who walked out on a wedding 2 hours before it began." She stared at him, trying to reconcile the man before her with the headlines she'd once glanced past on glossy covers. "So I was your escape plan." He looked at her, then really looked. The kind of gaze that stripped every defense away. "No," he said. "You were the first thing that felt real." The words struck her harder than any apology could. But reality came crashing back. The paparazzi, the world that would chew her up for breakfast. Her laugh was hollow. "Real. You married a stranger in Vegas, Ethan. That's not real. That's chaos wearing perfume." He smiled faintly. "Maybe. But last night chaos felt better than the life I left behind." Aisha slid off the bed, pulling the sheet around her like armor. Her bare feet touched the cold marble. The contrast was sharp, too sharp. She walked to the window, staring down at the strip still pulsing with color. The world outside didn't care that her life had just imploded for the second time in a month. Behind her, Ethan spoke again, quieter. "You can walk away. I won't stop you." She turned, anger and confusion warring inside her. "Walk away? After what you've just made me the headline scandal of the decade?" He flinched. "I'll fix it." "How rewrite the past?" Her voice cracked. "You should have told me who you were." "I tried," he said. "But the moment felt too honest. I didn't want to break it." His honesty disarmed her as much as it infuriated her. She wanted to hate him, but the truth in his tone, raw, almost boyish, made it impossible. She sank into the armchair across from him, exhaling slowly. "So what happens now?" He studied her as though measuring the distance between them. "That depends on whether you want to disappear or stay." "Stay," she repeated, incredulous. "In what? Your world of penthouses and press releases?" "No, thank you." He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. The morning light caught the faint bruise at his jawline, a mark she hadn't noticed before. "My world," he said, "isn't what you think it is." There was something tired in his voice, something lonely. "I grew up surrounded by everything, money, power, people who said yes to anything. But none of it meant anything. Every room I walked into felt like a negotiation. Every person I touched wanted something. Until you. Until me. You didn't ask for anything. You didn't know who I was. You just saw me." The sincerity in his voice hit her like a chord struck too deep. For a long moment, neither spoke. Finally, she rose and walked toward the bedroom mirror. Her reflection stared back, her curls messy, her eyes soft but wary. She looked like a woman standing on the edge of two worlds, unsure which would crumble first. She whispered almost to herself, "I don't belong here." Ethan stood behind her, their eyes meeting in the glass. "Neither do I," he said. Maybe that's why it worked. Something in the way he said it, quiet, vulnerable, made her chest ache. And for the first time she saw beyond the billionaire facade, a man burdened by legacy, drowning in privilege, desperate to be seen as more than a name. She turned to face him. "Why did you walk out on your wedding?" He hesitated, then answered, "Because I looked at the woman waiting for me at the altar, and I couldn't remember what love felt like. Then I saw my reflection on the church doors and didn't recognize the man standing there. So I left, and ended up marrying me instead." His lips curved faintly. Fate has a sense of humor. Aisha's breath caught part disbelief, part recognition. They were both running from betrayal, from expectations from themselves. And somehow, they had collided mid-flight. The silence between them softened. The morning light shifted, washing the room in gold. Ethan poured 2 cups of coffee, handed one to her. Their fingers brushed. The touch was brief, but it lingered. "Are you angry?" he asked. She sipped the coffee, eyes on the horizon, where the desert met the sky. "I don't know. I think I'm too tired to be angry." He nodded. Tired is honest. She looked at him, then seeing not the billionaire, but the man beneath, the one who, despite everything, still sought redemption. "Ethan," she said softly, "I don't do perfect. I don't do promises I can't keep." "I'm not asking for either," he replied. "Just a chance to make today less of a mistake than yesterday." She almost smiled. "That's not a very romantic proposal. I'm not a very romantic man." "Yes, you are," she murmured. "You just don't know it." Outside, the fountains erupted again, their rhythm steady and defiant. Aisha set her cup down and stood beside him by the window. The city glittered below, endless and bright. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "It's an illusion," he said. She glanced at him. "Maybe. But some illusions are worth believing in for a little while." Ethan looked at her, and in his eyes she saw the same longing that had kept her painting light all her life. The need to find beauty in imperfection. Neither of them moved. The world outside continued spinning, oblivious, alive. Finally, he reached out, tentative, his fingers brushing hers again. Not a claim. Not a question. Just a quiet offering. And this time she didn't pull away. Later, when he left for a phone call that couldn't wait, Aisha stood alone in the silence. On the table lay the newspaper, their picture staring back at her like fate's cruel signature. She picked it up, folded it carefully, and placed it inside her sketchbook. If her life was going to be a headline, she'd at least make it art. Outside, sunlight spilled through the glass like forgiveness. For the first time in months, she didn't turn away from it. New York greeted her not with warmth, but with whispers. By the time Aisha and Ethan stepped off the private jet, the headlines had already spread like wildfire. The painter and the Prince Whitmore's surprise wife. Gold digger or muse. Inside, the secret Vegas marriage. Her name had become a spectacle. Every morning her face appeared on tabloids she'd never read, attached to stories she'd never told. She married him for the money. He married her out of rebellion. How long before the art fades and the fortune stays? Each word was a blade disguised as curiosity. And yet every cut bled the same question, one she'd begun to ask herself in the quiet. What did she truly mean to him? The Whitmore estate in Manhattan was everything the world imagined, grand, immaculate, and unbearably quiet. Marble floors so polished they reflected your fears back at you. Chandeliers that never flickered even when the people beneath them did. Aisha moved through it like a ghost in silk. Every servant bowed, every hallway gleamed. Yet she had never felt smaller. Even Ethan's presence, steady, reassuring, couldn't silence the dissonance inside her. He had returned to work, the world of boardrooms and shareholders reclaiming him. She spent her days in a sunlit room on the 3rd floor, a converted studio he'd built for her. Canvas, paint, silence. It should have been heaven, but heaven, she realized, was unbearable when it didn't feel like home. The first crack came with color. She'd tried painting again. Gold, her old companion, the hue of light breaking through shadow. But this time the paint wouldn't hold. It spread wrong, fractured under the brush, bleeding into gray. Her hand trembled. The more she tried to fix it, the worse it got, like her art was refusing to lie for her. When the brush finally slipped, splattering gold across her skin, she sank to the floor, exhausted. The color gleamed against her dark fingers, a cruel mirror of everything the world saw before it listened. That was how Victoria found her. Mrs. Victoria Whitmore entered without ceremony. She was a woman carved from elegance, pearls, posture, and an aura that had weathered decades of storms. Her eyes, gray and sharp, missed nothing. "I thought I'd find you here," she said, her tone neither kind nor cruel. "You've been avoiding the press." Aisha stayed seated on the floor, her breath uneven. "Avoiding isn't the word. Escaping, maybe." Victoria studied the ruined canvas, the spilled paint, the quiet ache in the room. "It's beautiful," she said finally. "It's broken," Aisha murmured. "Then it's honest." Aisha looked up. For a moment, the steel in Victoria's expression softened. She crossed the room and picked up a fallen brush, turning it between her fingers, like evidence of courage. "You know," she said, "I was 23 when I married into this family. I thought love would be my armor. It turned out to be my target." Aisha blinked. She hadn't expected confession. Victoria continued, her voice low. "I was the outsider once. Not because of my skin, but because of where I came from. Money doesn't erase difference. It amplifies it." The words settled between them like dust on sunlight. "You don't need to be accepted," my dear, Victoria said gently, laying the brush beside her. "You only need to stand. That's what women in this house have learned after tears, after noise. Standing is survival." Aisha felt something crack, not in pain, but in understanding. A part of her had been waiting for permission to be small, to blend in. Now she realized she never would. And maybe that was her strength. When Victoria left, Aisha sat for a long time, staring at the canvas. She picked up her brush. The gold was still there, imperfect, splintered, but when she pressed it to the surface, it shimmered differently, like light that had learned its scars. That night, Ethan came home late. The sound of his key in the door pulled her from sleep she hadn't really fallen into. He looked tired, his suit rumpled tie undone, hair mussed by the weight of the day. But when his eyes met hers, the exhaustion softened. "You're awake," he said quietly. She nodded. "You weren't answering your phone." He exhaled. "Board meetings. My father. Same war, different day." She studied him, the sharp lines of his jaw, the flicker of something unspoken behind his calm. There were things he wasn't telling her. She could feel it in the pauses between his words. "Ethan," she said softly, "am I a problem you're trying to fix?" He froze. "What everyone looks at me like I'm a mistake you'll eventually correct." The silence that followed was long and careful. Then he crossed the room, sitting beside her on the edge of the bed. "You're not a mistake, Aisha. Then what am I?" He hesitated. "You're a risk." Her breath hitched. He smiled faintly. "And I've never felt more alive taking one." His honesty disarmed her. Still, the ache remained, the ache of being seen and yet misunderstood. She reached for the sketch pad on her nightstand, flipping it open to a half-finished drawing. He glanced at it, two hands almost touching the space between them, filled with light. "Who are they?" he asked. "People who keep trying," she said, "even when the world tells them to stop." Ethan took the pad, gently placed it aside. Then he reached for her ruined canvas from earlier, the one she'd left in the corner, fractured with gold. He set it upright on the easel. "Paint it again," he said softly. "I already ruined it." Then start over. But this time, don't paint for the galleries. Or for me. Paint for you. Something in his tone, firm but tender, broke the last of her restraint. She turned toward him, her eyes bright with the tears she'd been holding for weeks. "Why do you care so much?" "Because," he said, brushing a strand of hair from her face, "when you stop painting it, feels like the world loses color." Her breath caught. He leaned in, kissed her forehead, a gesture more intimate than desire. And in that quiet, she realized how dangerous love could be when it began to feel safe. The next morning, Aisha stood in front of the window watching the city wake. Headlines still screamed her name, but the noise no longer owned her. On the table beside her sat a new canvas, unfinished but alive. The strokes were raw, the colors chaotic, yet something about it glowed. She'd called it cracks in the gold, because now she understood perfection was sterile, but broken things let the light through. That afternoon, a message arrived on her phone. A photograph of Ethan and another woman at a charity gala from 2 months before. The caption read, "Old habits die hard." Her stomach twisted. She knew the press would twist everything. She told herself not to care. But some doubts came from within, not outside. When Ethan came home that night, she didn't ask. She simply painted each brushstroke sharper, freer. He watched her from the doorway, something unreadable in his eyes. "What are you painting?" he asked. She didn't look up. "The truth, whatever it turns out to be." He smiled softly. "Then, I hope I'm in it." "Maybe," she said, "if you earn your place." He didn't answer, just crossed the room, kissed the top of her head, and left her to her work. When the door closed, she exhaled a long, trembling breath. The house was quiet again, but no longer empty. In the stillness, she could almost hear the gold cracking open, letting something real pour through. That night, she dreamed of light. Not pure, not blinding, but scattered like pieces of glass catching sunrise. And for the first time, it didn't scare her. It felt like healing. The night of the exhibition felt like standing inside a heartbeat. The Whitmore Gallery, once a symbol of everything that intimidated Aisha, now carried her name in silver letters across the entrance. Light and Wounds, a new collection by Aisha Davis. The title had made critics curious. The paintings made them silent. Inside, soft jazz played under the murmur of champagne glasses. Every wall shimmered with her work, saturated colors, fractured light silhouettes suspended between despair and grace. She had painted pain as if it were something holy, something that deserved to be looked at without flinching. Aisha stood quietly in a corner, her hands clasped together, watching strangers study pieces that had once been private confessions. Their admiration didn't flatter her, it frightened her, because it meant they saw too much. Then she felt it, that shift in the room, that subtle tightening of air when someone important walked in. She didn't need to turn around to know who it was. Ethan. He moved through the crowd with the quiet assurance of someone born into attention, but bored by it. Yet tonight, his presence was different, stripped of arrogance, almost reverent. He wasn't here as a Whitmore. He was here as a man looking for something he'd lost. When he reached her, he didn't speak at first. His eyes were on the walls on her. He began, but words failed. She smiled faintly. "You don't have to say anything." He shook his head, his voice barely above a whisper. "No, I do. Because standing here I realize I've never really seen you before, not like this." For a moment, she looked away, overwhelmed. The noise of the gallery faded until all she could hear was the soft hum of her own pulse. Near the center of the room hung the only painting not marked for sale. Hands in the Dark. It was simple at first glance. Two hands reaching for each other, one pale, one brown, meeting in a pool of shadow. But up close, the details told another story. Tiny fractures, threads of light weaving through every crack. Ethan stopped in front of it, his expression unreadable. "Why not sell this one?" he asked. "Because," she said quietly, "some things are meant to be kept, not owned." He turned to her, something soft breaking in his eyes. "You know," he said, "I used to think love was a luxury, a distraction for people who didn't have empires to run." Her heart tightened. "And now?" she asked. He looked back at the painting. "Now I know it's the only reason any of this money, power, all of it matters at all. Without love, everything else is just noise." The words hung between them, like a confession neither had planned to make. She wanted to tell him she believed him, but trust was a fragile thing, built slowly and easily broken. So instead, she stepped closer, close enough to smell the faint scent of his cologne, to see the weariness in his eyes. "I used to think light was a lie," she said softly. "Something the world invented to make darkness easier to bear. But maybe it's just been waiting for the right hands to reflect it." Ethan smiled, the kind of smile that didn't reach his mouth, but changed his whole face. He lifted his hand, hesitated, then brushed a strand of hair from her cheek. "Then keep painting," he whispered, "because the world needs the truth the way I need you." The words should have sounded grandiose, but they didn't. They felt earned. Later, after the last glass was emptied and the crowd dispersed, Aisha walked through the quiet gallery alone. The city glittered beyond the glass windows, alive, indifferent, beautiful. When she reached hands in the dark again, she found Ethan still there, hands in his pockets, head tilted slightly, as though seeing something invisible. "You stayed," she said. He didn't turn, couldn't leave. She stepped beside him, their shoulders almost touching. "What do you see?" He smiled faintly. "Two people finding each other in the dark." "Do they stay?" she asked. "That depends," he said, glancing at her on whether they're brave enough to keep reaching. Something in her chest softened, a quiet surrender, not of will, but of fear. Maybe love wasn't a promise. Maybe it was simply the courage to show up again and again, even when everything inside you wanted to run. That night, in the dim glow of the penthouse overlooking Central Park, they didn't speak much. Words had become unnecessary. Ethan poured her a glass of wine, his movements unhurried, reverent. When their eyes met, there was no distance left to cross. They moved toward each other, not out of desire alone, but out of recognition. Two people who had learned the shape of solitude and were no longer afraid to be known. When he kissed her, it wasn't feverish. It was slow, deliberate, like a prayer whispered in both directions. He touched her, as if memorizing every line of her, not as conquest, but as confession. And she, who had once painted love as absence, now felt it pulse beneath her skin, steady, alive, undeniable. When they finally lay together, there was no pretense, no walls, just warmth and the quiet rhythm of breath in sync with another's. In the soft light, Aisha traced the curve of his shoulder, her voice barely audible. "I don't want to lose myself." He turned, eyes open, voice steady. "Then don't. I don't want to own you. I just want to meet you where you already are." The honesty of it unraveled her. She pressed her forehead to his, closing her eyes. And in that stillness, the world outside faded, the headlines, the doubt, the noise. There was only this, two hearts that had been broken differently, beating now in unison. At dawn, pale light spilled across the sheets. Aisha woke first. Ethan slept beside her, one arm draped over her waist, his breath steady against her shoulder. For a while she simply watched him. In sleep he looked younger, stripped of the armor he wore in daylight. Vulnerable. Human. Her gaze drifted to the skyline beyond the window. The city was stirring sirens, distant horns, the hum of a world that never really stopped. But inside the room, time held its breath. A quiet peace filled her, a stillness she hadn't known since before the heartbreak, before the fame, before everything. She turned onto her side, her hand unconsciously resting on her stomach. A faint, unfamiliar warmth stirred beneath her palm. A flutter, a whisper of something forming. She froze, then smiled, not out of certainty, but intuition. It wasn't fear, it wasn't surprise. It was recognition. Something new was being created not from perfection, but from the collision of two souls that had refused to give up on the idea of light. A tear slipped down her cheek, though she wasn't sad. For the first time in her life, she didn't feel like she was painting alone. Hours later, as sunlight flooded the penthouse, Ethan woke to find her standing by the window wrapped in one of his shirts. She turned when she heard him, her smile quiet, knowing. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, his voice still rough from sleep. "Beginnings," she said. He smiled. "Good ones. The kind that scare you," she answered, "because they feel too real." He crossed the room, stopping behind her, his arm circling her waist. "Then let's be scared together." She leaned back into him, closing her eyes as the city blazed gold outside their window. Neither of them said the word love. They didn't need to. It was already there in every breath, every silence, every heartbeat that no longer belonged to one person alone. The news broke on a Tuesday morning. By evening, her name was everywhere. The artist and the heir, is it love or a trap? Whitmore's wife, expecting a paycheck. They didn't even call her by name anymore. Just the artist, the woman, the scandal. Aisha stared at the glowing screen until the letters blurred into nothing. The comments burned more than the headlines, cruel, faceless words disguised as curiosity. She planned this. Pregnancy is her golden ticket, classic gold digger move. Each one was a small death. Because no matter how far she'd come, no matter what she'd created, her skin and her silence made her an easy story to rewrite. At first, Ethan tried to shield her. He ordered lawyers, PR teams, statements. "Let me handle it," he said. But it wasn't a problem to handle. It was a wound to survive. She stopped going to the studio. The press followed her car camped outside the gates. Even her art became suspect, as if her hands had suddenly forgotten how to be honest. By the third week, the pressure felt unbearable. And when one of the tabloids ran a photo of Ethan with his ex-fiancée at a charity event taken before their marriage, but twisted into proof of betrayal, something inside her snapped. That night, she packed a single suitcase, left a note on his desk, and disappeared. Aspen was quiet that time of year. Snow swallowed everything, noise, color, time. She rented a cabin at the edge of the forest, the kind of place where silence wasn't empty, but healing. Mornings were slow. Firelight. Tea cooling untouched. Sketches half drawn on cheap paper. She told herself she'd left for peace, but peace didn't come easily to those who'd lived too long in noise. The baby's heartbeat echoed inside her, small, steady, miraculous. Every flutter reminded her she wasn't entirely alone. Still at night, the loneliness crawled back, sharp and familiar. She'd touch her stomach, whisper softly, "You'll never have to earn your right to exist. Not like I did." 3 days into the storm, she heard the knock. At first, she thought it was the wind, but then it came again, louder, desperate. Her heart raced. She opened the door, and the blizzard roared in. Ethan stood there covered in snow. His hair soaked, his coat stiff with ice. He looked like a man who'd been walking for days. Aisha, he breathed. His voice cracked from cold and exhaustion. For a moment she couldn't move. The sight of him, real raw trembling, undid every wall she'd built. "What are you doing here?" she whispered. He stepped inside, shutting the door behind him, the storm howling on the other side. "I've been looking for you everywhere." "You shouldn't have." "I had to." He pulled off his gloves, his fingers shaking. The air between them was thick with anger, with love, with everything they hadn't said. "You left," he said quietly. "You let me." He flinched. "You think I wanted you gone? I think you didn't stop me." Silence. The fire crackled between them, its light flickering against his face. Tired, haunted, beautiful. Finally he said, "They can say what they want about me, about money, about power. But the thought of them tearing you apart, that's what I can't stand." Her voice broke. "I didn't want to become another story they could twist." "They don't matter," he said. "You do." She turned away, staring at the window. Outside, snow blurred the world into white. "I thought leaving would make it easier," she said. "But every time I tried to forget, I remembered the way you looked at me that night, like you finally saw me. And I hated you for that, for making me believe I was safe." Ethan stepped closer, his tone low but steady. "I can't undo what the world says, but I can choose what I stand for, and I choose you, Aisha, every single time." She looked up, eyes glassy. "And what about your family? Your company? The empire with your name on it?" He smiled bitter and soft. "Let them keep the name. I'm done living for people who only care how it sounds." When she didn't answer, he dropped to his knees in front of her, not out of drama, but because his strength had finally run out. Snow clung to his hair, melted down his collar. His voice was barely a whisper. "I'm not afraid of losing my name, my wealth, my place. I'm only afraid of losing you." For a heartbeat, she couldn't breathe. Then quietly, painfully, she sank down beside him. Her hand found his face, cold beneath her touch. She traced the edge of his jaw, his cheek, the place where exhaustion had carved him hollow. "You don't have to give up the world for me," she said. He looked up at her eyes, dark and clear. If that's the price of peace, then maybe the world was never worth keeping. The tears came before she could stop them. Hot against his skin, they slid down her cheeks as she whispered, "Just stay." He nodded, and for a moment, neither moved. Two figures caught in the center of a storm, holding on as if the wind itself might carry them apart. They spent the night by the fire, wrapped in blankets and silence. Ethan's hands were rough with cold, hers trembling from release. Between them, something fragile and fierce bloomed again. Not the reckless fire of Vegas, but a quiet, enduring warmth. At one point, she stirred, resting her hand on her stomach. He followed the motion, his gaze softening. "Is it true?" She nodded, her smile trembling. He closed his eyes, exhaling, as if he'd been holding his breath for weeks. "I'm sorry I wasn't there when you found out. You're here now," she said simply. Outside, the storm raged, relentless. But inside the cabin pulsed with its own rhythm, the steady crackle of fire, the slow intertwining of breath, the sound of forgiveness spoken without words. Before dawn, she woke to find him standing by the window, staring out into the fading snow. "What are you thinking?" she asked sleepily. He turned, his voice quiet. "That I've spent my whole life trying to build walls to keep the world out. But somehow you walked right through them." Aisha smiled faintly. "Maybe because I wasn't trying to take anything. Just to stay." He crossed the room, crouched beside her again, and took her hand. "Then promise me you'll stay now. Through all of it. Even when it gets ugly." She brushed her thumb across his knuckles. "If I promise that, promise me. You'll stop apologizing for loving me." He laughed softly. The sound cracked real human. "Deal." They leaned into each other forehead to forehead as the last of the snow settled outside. Morning light crept in pale and forgiving. Later, as they stood by the window, the world looked new again. The storm had cleared, leaving everything blank and untouched, a canvas waiting for color. Aisha pressed her palm to the glass, her reflection merging with the snow beyond. "There's something about the way snow falls," she murmured. "It buries everything ugly, at least for a while." Ethan stepped behind her, his arms circling her waist. "Then let it. We'll dig out what's worth keeping." She smiled, leaning back into him. "You sound like a man who finally believes in light." He kissed her temple. "No, I believe in you." Outside, the snow still whispered against the cabin roof, soft and unending. Inside by the fire, warmth returned slow, fragile, real. The world could scream what it wanted. But here in this quiet corner of white, they had found something stronger than noise. Not perfection, not peace, but the courage to begin again. The morning she went into labor, the world outside was quiet, too quiet, as if holding its breath. It was early March, the kind of dawn that came slowly dripping gold over snow, still clinging to the mountains. Aisha felt the first pain like a wave rolling through her sharp, real, unstoppable. Ethan had been beside her in an instant. Eyes wide movements, frantic and tender all at once. They hadn't planned for it to happen here in the small aspen cabin where the world had forgotten them. But maybe she thought between breaths, that's exactly why it happened here. Life always came back where it had once broken. Hours later, the midwife, an old woman from the nearby town, placed a tiny bundle in Aisha's arms. The room fell into a hush. The fire crackled. The wind outside had softened to a whisper. And in her arms, their daughter, small, impossibly delicate, opened her eyes for the first time. Gray. Not her mother's brown. Not her father's blue. Something between storm and sunrise. Aisha's heart twisted. "Hello, my love," she whispered. "Welcome to the mess we call a world." The baby yawned, a soft sound that broke Ethan entirely. He stood frozen for a moment before reaching out, unsure, his large hands trembling. Aisha smiled faintly. "She won't break." He laughed, though his voice cracked. "I might." When she placed the baby into his arms, something in him seemed to fall away. All the armor, all the noise. His breath hitched, his eyes glistened. He whispered, barely audible, "I used to think everything had a price. Every deal, every dream, every life. But this." He looked down at their daughter, his voice trembling. "This is the first thing I've ever held that money could never touch." Aisha felt the tears spill freely, then hot and pure. "That's because she's not ours to own, only ours to love." He nodded slowly, his thumb brushing the baby's tiny hand, and when those small fingers curled around his entire world shifted from control to surrender, from possession to devotion. They named her Hope, because, as Aisha said with a tired smile, she came from despair, and yet she carries light. The name fit her instantly, fragile, defiant, alive. Later that night, while the baby slept in the cradle Ethan had built from reclaimed wood, Aisha sat by the window, wrapped in a blanket. The moonlight spilled across her face, soft as forgiveness. Her body ached. Her heart felt full in a way that frightened her. Motherhood, she realized, wasn't about perfection. It was about surrender, the willingness to love something so deeply you'd break for it again and again. She heard Ethan moving in the kitchen, clumsy, but trying, warming milk, adjusting the fire, keeping the cabin alive in his own way. And for the first time since she'd met him, the silence between them felt safe. A few days later, Aisha unpacked her paints again. The cabin had turned into a small world of warmth and breath. Baby blankets drying near the hearth canvases leaning against walls, the faint smell of pine and smoke. Hope slept beside her, bundled in soft gray wool. Aisha stared at the blank canvas, unsure how to begin. Her body was still fragile, her emotions raw, but there was something inside her that demanded to be released, not pain this time, but something that had grown quietly beneath it. She dipped her brush into white, then gold, then the deep amber of dawn. Each stroke felt like breathing again after holding it too long. By dusk, the image had emerged, a shattered vase, fractured but radiant. From every crack spilled light, imperfect, untamed, beautiful. She called it Light Reborn. When Ethan came in carrying Hope in his arms, he stopped short. The painting glowed in the firelight, more alive than anything he'd ever seen. He looked at her eyes, soft. "That's what it felt like," he whispered. "What did she ask?" "The moment she was born. Like everything broken inside me was being filled with light again." Aisha smiled, exhaustion softening her edges. "That's because you finally stopped running from the dark." He set the baby in her arms, then knelt beside them, his forehead resting gently against hers. "You were the light all along. I just didn't know how to see it." The following weeks passed in rhythms, new and old feedings, laughter, long silences that didn't need mending. Sometimes Aisha woke at dawn to find Ethan asleep on the floor beside the cradle, one hand still reaching toward his daughter. Other times, she'd paint until her fingers ached, her strokes softer now, as if she'd made peace with imperfection. Her work began to shift. Critics, when they eventually saw it, would call it her redemption period. But to her, it was simply the season when she stopped painting pain as a wound and started painting it as proof of survival. Yet even in peace, fear lingered, the quiet kind that comes after storms, when the world is still too calm. Aisha sometimes caught herself staring out the window, wondering when the outside world would come knocking again. The press, the past, the judgments. Ethan noticed. One night, as they sat by the fire, he reached for her hand. "Do you ever miss it?" he asked. "What?" "The noise, the city, the attention." She thought for a moment. "Sometimes. But I think what I really miss is the illusion of control." He chuckled softly. "You sound like me." "Maybe we're both recovering addicts," she said with a grin. "Addicted to chaos." He turned serious then. "When we go back, and we will go back, things won't be easy. People will still talk." "I know. And I can't protect you from all of it." "I don't want protection," she said. "I want partnership." That made him pause. Then with quiet conviction he said, "Then we'll face it together." A few nights later, she finished the last painting of the series. She stood in front of it, Hope sleeping soundly in her arms, and felt something shift inside her, a closure she hadn't expected. Every brushstroke was a story, the woman who had been betrayed, the girl who had run, the artist who had learned to stay. Each crack glowed with gold, as if the light had been waiting for its cue to return. Ethan came up behind her, wrapping his arms gently around her waist. "What do you see?" he asked. She smiled faintly. "Proof." "Of what?" "That nothing we love is ever truly lost. It just changes form until we're ready to see it again." He pressed a kiss to her temple. "Then maybe that's what hope is. Everything we thought we'd lost, finding its way back." In the soft hours before dawn, Aisha sat by the window again. Hope stirred in her cradle, cooing softly as the first light of morning crept across the floorboards. Outside, snow melted into water running in silver threads down the mountainside. The air smelled like pine and promise. Aisha looked down at her daughter, then at her paint-stained hands. She whispered not to anyone, but to the quiet that had once scared her. Thank you for breaking me, for letting the light back in. When the sun finally rose, Ethan found her asleep on the chair, hope in her arms, the finished painting glowing softly on the easel behind them. He stood there for a long time, watching the two of them, the woman who had taught him love, the child who had given it meaning. He smiled to himself and whispered, the light came back. 3 years later, Chicago shimmered under spring sunlight, the kind that softened glass towers and made the lake look alive again. At the edge of Michigan Avenue, a new building stood elegant modern, its glass facade reflecting both sky and city. Above the entrance, engraved in silver letters, the Whitmore Foundation for Hope. It had taken years to build. Not the structure itself, but the meaning behind it. A foundation dedicated to supporting young artists of color, giving them what Aisha never had a chance to create without begging for permission. Inside the grand hall buzzed with life. Cameras flashed, journalists murmured, and hundreds of guests filled the space. Philanthropists, painters, dreamers, doubters. At the center of it all stood Aisha Whitmore. She wore ivory, not for purity, but for peace. Beside her, Ethan adjusted his tie, looking almost uncomfortable in his dark suit. On his lap, their daughter Hope sat proudly, a small bundle of curls and confidence in a lilac dress. "Mommy, are you nervous?" the girl asked her gray eyes. Those familiar, impossible eyes searching her mother's face. Aisha smiled, bending down to fix a strand of her daughter's hair. "A little. Don't be," Hope said matter-of-factly. "You made this place. It's yours." Ethan chuckled softly. "She gets that from you." "No," Aisha said, her gaze warm. "She gets it from us." When the ceremony began, the lights dimmed. The crowd fell silent as Aisha stepped up to the podium. For a moment, she just stood there, breathing, feeling the weight of years settle and lift all at once. Behind her, a projection displayed a quote from her latest exhibition. "Light doesn't erase darkness. It learns to live beside it." She began softly, her voice steady and melodic. 3 years ago, I thought my story ended in a storm. But sometimes storms are where things begin. A ripple of murmurs ran through the audience. She continued, each word measured honest. "I built this foundation for those who were told no before they ever got the chance to show the world their yes. For those who were seen only by the color of their skin or the shape of their pain instead of the brilliance of their light." Her eyes swept the room and then stopped. Near the back, half hidden in the crowd, stood James, the man she had once loved, the man whose betrayal had been her first breaking. He looked older. The arrogance was gone, replaced by something quieter. Regret, perhaps. He held his hat in his hands, eyes fixed on her, like someone watching the ending of a story they no longer belonged to. Aisha didn't flinch. She kept speaking. "I used to think love was something that had to be perfect to be real. But I learned that love, real love, is what survives imperfection. It's what we build after the world has burned down the easy parts." Her voice trembled, but she didn't stop. "And I want to thank every mistake that brought me here, because without them, I wouldn't have found the right road, or the right hands to hold while walking it." There was a hush, the kind that fills a space not with silence, but with understanding. Ethan watched her from the front row, eyes glistening, pride and awe mingling in his expression. And in that instant, he realized she didn't just survive the world's judgment. She had rewritten the narrative entirely. When the applause erupted, it was thunderous. After the ceremony, as guests mingled and cameras flashed, Aisha slipped out to the terrace for a breath of air. The sky was streaked in hues of orange, and rose the kind of light that only existed between day and night. Ethan joined her a moment later, Hope asleep in his arms, her small head resting against his shoulder. He leaned against the railing beside her, quiet for a long time before speaking. "You were incredible," he said softly. She smiled. "I didn't fall off the stage." "That's enough." He laughed quietly, then looked down at their daughter. "She's going to remember this, you know. Maybe not today, but someday." Aisha nodded. "That's why I wanted her here. I want her to grow up knowing that her mother didn't just survive the story, she changed it." Ethan's gaze softened. "And what about him?" She knew who he meant. "James?" she asked. He nodded. "Do you forgive him?" She turned toward the fading skyline, her hair catching the last light of day. "Forgiveness isn't the point," she said. "I don't carry him anymore. You can't forgive what you've already forgotten." He reached for her hand. "That's a better kind of freedom." She squeezed his fingers gently, the only kind that lasts. They stood there watching the sun melt into the horizon. The lake shimmered beneath them, gold, bleeding into silver. Aisha thought of how far they'd come from the night in Las Vegas, where chaos first introduced them to the storm in Aspen, to this quiet victory built not from revenge, but from grace. Love, she realized, wasn't a rescue. It was a return, not to the person you were before you broke, but to the person you were meant to become because of it. Inside, music drifted from the gala, soft jazz, and laughter echoing against glass walls. Guests toasted, smiled, celebrated. But outside on the terrace, time slowed. Ethan wrapped his free arm around her shoulders, pulling her close. The warmth of him, the steady rhythm of his breathing, the weight of their child. It all felt impossibly full. "Do you ever think," he murmured, "that maybe everything we went through was supposed to happen?" Aisha rested her head against his shoulder. "Maybe not supposed to, but necessary." He smiled. "Necessary hurts." "So does growing," she whispered. Hope stirred slightly in his arms, sighing in her sleep. Ethan looked down, then back at Aisha. "Do you think she'll ever know how much light she brought back?" "She doesn't need to," Aisha said. "She is the light." Later, when the crowd had gone and the hall was empty, Aisha walked through the gallery of the foundation. On one wall hung her final piece, "Where the Light Begins." It showed a woman standing at the edge of water, her back to the viewer, the horizon ahead blazing in gold. In the corner of the painting, barely visible, a small child's hand reached toward hers. Underneath, a single line was engraved in gold leaf. "Love doesn't make us perfect. It teaches us how to be gentle with our scars." Aisha stood there for a long time, the words reflecting softly in her eyes. For years she had painted to escape her pain. Now she painted to celebrate its survival. Behind her, Ethan's footsteps approached. He didn't speak, just wrapped his arm around her waist. Together they stood before the painting as the last lights dimmed, leaving only the glow of the canvas before them. Outside, the city shimmered against the darkening lake lights, flickering like a constellation of second chances. For once, it wasn't blinding. It was honest. Aisha exhaled long and slow and smiled. "Do you feel that?" Ethan looked at her. "What?" "The calm," she said. "After everything, it's still here." He kissed her forehead. "Maybe peace isn't what we find. Maybe it's what we build." She looked up at him, her eyes warm, alive. "Then let's keep building." As they stepped into the night, the doors behind them closed, and the city lights reflected across the glass fragments of gold, fragments of love, fragments of everything they'd fought to protect. And in that shimmering reflection, mother, father, child, light truly began again. True love doesn't make us flawless, It teaches us how to be gentle with our scars. If this story touched your heart, share it because somewhere someone might be waiting for a reason to believe in love again.